Perspective. Dr. Kaizer Nyatsumba, a chartered director, a turnaround strategy expert, business rescue practitioner, the author of just under 20 books, and a former newspaper editor. Welcome to Perspective, Dr. Kaizer Nyatsumba's podcast that focuses on business, politics, corporate governance, social issues, English grammar, and anything else that takes his fancy. The first talk show host on SABC1, where he presented Dilemma in Perspective, Dr. Nyatsumba now presents his hard-hitting, no-holds-barred podcast, Dr. Kaizer's Perspective. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the inaugural episode of my podcast. Why have I decided to join the podcast trail? Well, a former colleague of mine, Melissa Sibindi, who was the marketing manager at SIFSA at some stage, forwarded to me a particular podcast in August 2025 with the following message, and I quote her verbatim. Greetings. I think you could and should consider a podcast. With your experience and connections, more people must hear of you. My humble thoughts, unquote. As I reflected on Melissa's suggestion, my appetite was whetted. The more I thought about it, the more it made logical sense to me. Therefore, thanks to Melissa Sibindi and some members of my family, here I am. What will I focus on in my podcast? Well, I'm a man of varied interests who has reasonable familiarity with or expertise in different subjects. Therefore, as what will be a standing introduction to my podcast indicates, Dr. Kaizer's Perspective will touch on politics, business, corporate governance, social issues, English grammar, and whatever may tickle my fancy at the time. The format will vary from one-person reviews to interviews with one or two people at a time. Well, in this episode, we will conduct a political preview of the year ahead and to some extent, a review of recent events. As with everything else that we will do in this podcast, that preview will be more critical, or should I say more robust, than a mere listing of events and issues. First, let me get a few things out in the open. One, I am a patriot who loves this beautiful country dearly. This is notwithstanding the fact that I am increasingly disappointed with what passes for public leadership in this country. Two, I have no faith in the African National Congress, which has governed this country for the past 30 years. Although the first 15 years of our democracy were ones of which we all could justly be proud, I'm one of those South Africans who have been bitterly disappointed with the poor state of the country at the moment, especially what we have witnessed in the last 15 years plus. Today, most South Africans are poorer than they were in 2008 when Thabo Mbeki was recalled as head of state. Three, despite my disappointment with the country, I continue to keep an open mind instead of being an ideologue. Therefore, I hope to interview in this podcast people from different perspectives. Three, despite my disappointment with the terrible state of our country, I continue to keep an open mind instead of being an ideologue. Therefore, I hope to interview in this podcast people from the different political parties, including the ANC, if they will make themselves available to be interviewed. We begin this episode of our podcast with a review of the ANC's 114th anniversary celebration. You will recall that the celebration took place at Maruleng Stadium in the Northwest Province, and it was very poorly attended. You will know too, no doubt, that various excuses have been advanced for that state of affairs. Now, I did not watch that January 8th celebration on TV. To tell the honest truth, I hardly ever listened to or watch any speech given by President Ramaphosa in recent years. I've long found that he says many good things in his speeches, but that he hardly delivers on them. As for the organization that he leads, I've long found it to be caught in a time warp. It talks and governs in the mid-2020s as though the world was still in the 1970s. There has been absolute reluctance, in my view, or inability to move with the times. Hence, even the language used, such as the usual reference to the National Democratic Revolution, is that of the pre-1990s era. I was pleased, therefore, to read a broad review of the ANC's January 8, 2026 statement in Dr. Yakub Abba Omar's column in Business Day last Thursday. As I read that column, I was not surprised to see in that statement that the ANC had declared 2026 the year of decisive action to fix local government and transform the economy. Wow. 31 years since coming to power, the ANC has finally decided that this year would be, quote, a year of decisive action to fix local government and transform the economy. Now we may legitimately ask, what took the organization so long? I would have expected its determination to fix local government many years ago, when it could still be fixed relatively easily and more cheaply. In fact, I would have expected the ANC as a conscientious governing party to have ensured that local government did not deteriorate to the shameful levels that it now finds itself in. That, however, was not something towards which the ANC could have committed itself those many moons ago. Its priority then was to deploy its cadres into all government and public positions and to ensure that local governments were reduced to an empty shell, with the result that many towns and cities have long since become pale shadows of their former selves, with decrepit infrastructure and even sewerage-filled streets. No. Fixing local government was not the ANC's priority then. It could not have been. Now that is why 2026, a year in which the ANC is certain to suffer yet another humiliating defeat across the country, is, quote, the year of decisive action to fix local government, just because there are local government elections around the corner. That is not dissimilar to President Ramaphosa's discovery with shock, if I may add, in the year when South Africa was due to host the G20 group of countries, that the city of Johannesburg, in which he happens to live, was in such a parlous state. As a consequence of that discovery, 2025, therefore, became the year of decisive action to fix Johannesburg, or let's be honest, those parts of it to which the president's guess would be exposed. And what does the ANC mean when it declares 2026 the decisive year during which to transform the economy? Does it thereby mean that this is the year in which to make more ANC-aligned BEE multimillionaires and billionaires? How, pray tell, can the ANC transform a moribund economy? Shouldn't the priority be the creation of a climate conducive to domestic and foreign investment, and the review of those pieces of legislation that are deemed to be inimical to business? Shouldn't the ANC be committing itself to ending crime and to ensuring that our country's borders are no longer porous? No. Yet again, the ANC's priority is on transforming an economy that is on its deathbed, just because it believes that continued talk of transformation will continue to appeal to a constituency that has long seen through that organization. I found the following sentence in Dr. Omar's column very interesting, and I quote him verbatim. Ramaphosa's insistence that implementation needs to be prioritized is trotted out at every occasion possible, with ministers and officials repeating chorus like implement, 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 unquote. How very accurate. That sentence sums up for me beautifully the fact that this president has been big on talk, which is often parroted by its ministers and other officials, but very little, if anything, ever happens. On SABC1 News on Saturday, 10 January, the day on which the celebrations took place in the Northwest, President Ramaphosa was shown yet again using his favorite phrase, whether they like it or not. Now, if memory serves, on that occasion, he was insisting that the ANC would survive, whether they like it or not. Personally, I've long found that phrase most arrogant on the part of a political leader. You may recall that in the run-up to the 2024 national elections, the very ones that the ANC lost, Ramaphosa often stated that the ANC would win those elections, whether they like it or not. What arrogance! Instead of humbling himself before the electorate and begging it for one more chance, the ANC leader was, in effect, telling the very electorate that it had no choice but to vote for his party. If in not so many words, he was telling the electorate to go to hell because, whether they like it or not, his beloved organization was going to win the elections. Oh, how power turns otherwise reasonable people deaf to their own words and their import. As things turned out, the electorate responded thunderously. Well, it said, since you are so sure of victory without us, we will not bother to vote, or will vote for your opponents. It is baffling, therefore, that it knows notwithstanding, Ramaphosa continues to tell the people of South Africa that his organization will prevail regardless of their wishes, their views of it, or their experiences under it. Now, move on to another topic. Over the next few months, President Ramaphosa will receive the findings and recommendations of the Madlanga Commission that is probing corruption within the SAPS and related institutions. It will be interesting to see how eagerly he will implement that commission's recommendations. As things currently stand, one of those recommendations is certain, in my view, to be that he should let go of embattled Police Minister Senzo Mchunu. It is a great pity in the first instance that a man who should have been relieved of his duties as police minister continues to draw a salary from the public purse. Now, moving on to a third topic. Set to feature prominently in the public discourse this year is the so-called National Dialogue, a superfluous event if ever there was any. Regrettably, the so-called National Dialogue is bound to be no more than an opportunity for a fed-up citizenry to vent. It is a giant PR exercise, in my view, from which nothing concrete will eventuate. Why, you may ask, do I say so? Well, for the simple reason that South Africa has a duly elected parliament and a government of national unity, which are both legally entitled to run their respective affairs. Neither structure will take instruction from an unelected National Dialogue. Let us make comparisons with the original Convention for a Democratic South Africa, CODESA, and I ask that you please bear with me while I rehash that story. Some of us were around at the time and recall this very well. On 21 December 1991, various political parties and organizations gathered at the World Trade Center in Kempton Park for the beginning of multi-party negotiations in what came to be known as CODESA or CODESA 1. On the agenda for that meeting was the adoption of a declaration of intent that anchored all subsequent negotiations. It committed those parties that participated in those elections and those organizations that did so to most of the values that today find expression in our Constitution, such as bringing about, quote from that agreement, an undivided South Africa with one nation sharing a common citizenship, patriotism and loyalty, unquote. It also focused on healing the division of the past, striving to improve the quality of South Africans' lives, and to set in motion a process of writing the country's interim constitution that would have all the freedoms, that we take for granted today and ensure that the Constitution is a supreme law of the country, which will be guarded over by an independent, non-racial and impartial judiciary. Now, the adoption of that declaration of intent by all other parties in that gathering gave it huge legitimacy, as you could imagine, thus ensuring that it was binding on all parties and organizations that participated in the process. However, without a commitment from President F.W. de Klerk's government to bind itself by the agreements reached in that forum, CODESA, I suggest, would have been a colossal waste of time. It was very important, therefore, that in the same declaration of intent, de Klerk committed his government to implement those CODESA agreements. The last paragraph of that declaration of intent statement is very important. It states the following: we, the South African government, declare ourselves to be bound by agreements we reached together with other participants in CODESA in accordance with standing rules, and thereby commit ourselves to the implementation thereof within our capability, powers, and authority. I quote. Now, it was that last part of the declaration of intent, the part from the National Party leader and president of the country at the time, that encouraged the different parties to participate in the process, confident that any agreements that they reached would be implemented. De Klerk could give that commitment because his party had a majority in the House of Assembly. In the last all-wise elections in 1989, the National Party that he led had obtained 52.7% of the vote against the Conservative Party's 26.83% and the Democratic Party's 15.12%. He knew, therefore, that on its own, his party would have the numbers to pass legislation giving effect to agreements flowing from the CODESA talks. Can Ramaphosa do the same? Today, however, Ramaphosa leads an ANC that managed only 40% of the vote in the last election and leads a GNU made up of disparate parties, some of which are opposed to the very national dialogue. How will he ensure that the GNU accepts and implements the outcome of the national dialogue? How will he ensure that Parliament approves and implements whatever agreements eventuate from that expensive talk shop? Now, that is why I associate myself unreservedly with the millions of South Africans who have grave reservations about the wisdom and utility of the proposed national dialogue. Like them, I hold the view that it will be a colossal waste of people's time and the state's meager resources, which may lead to more anger being unleashed against Ramaphosa's government. Now, the more I think about it, the more I see the proposed national dialogue process as a big public relations exercise intended to mollify South Africans and to get them to feel heard. Unfortunately, when people eventually realize that they've been played, their anger is bound to multiply. The incontrovertible fact remains, in my view, that South Africa is in the terrible state it is in today because of the ANC. Regrettably, the Ramaphosa presidency, which promised so much, has not made much of a difference. Yes, there's been progress in some instances, but on numerous indices, South Africa is worse now than it was when Ramaphosa came to office in 2018. Now, in the unlikely event that some concrete agreement eventuates from the national dialogue process, what will its status be? Who will give effect to it? Let's say the national dialogue decides that there should be that a death sentence reinstalled in South Africa. What would happen to that? Let's say the national dialogue decides, for instance, that there should be tougher immigration laws in South Africa. Who will give effect to that? Nothing that I've read or heard so far has given any indication of the possible status of the outcome of the national dialogue process. Will it be a document to be stored in file 13, never to be looked at again? Or will it merely be referred to in passing from time to time whenever the masses dare to raise discontent about the country's governance? Now, I suggest that until such time that question can be answered with confidence, the whole national dialogue process is nothing but a poor PR exercise that is likely to backfire very badly. Now, to my final topic of the day. We conclude this first episode of Perspective with reference to the unedifying spectacle of a democratic alliance that finished 2024 and began this year with public discord within its ranks. I said elsewhere last year that it is much easier for organizations and parties that are in opposition to paint themselves white as though they were angels. I argued then that it is only once such parties are in power that we can begin to take seriously their claims to be incorruptible. The salacious allegations that DA leader John Steenhuisen and former Environment, Forestry and Fisheries Minister Dr. Deon George have recently flung at each other with wild abandon have got this country entranced. I am certain that were the DA not part of the government of national unity, none of these allegations would have seen the light of day. Chances are that we would not know that Steenhuisen had his party's credit card recalled because he was allegedly abusing it for personal benefit. Now, as Steenhuisen will have discovered by now, it is easy to be an opposition leader and to lead the process of throwing mud at those in power. All he was then was an elected leader who worked collegially with other leaders within his party. However, once the DA was in government, he had to exercise the authority of designating members of his party for appointment to or removal from the cabinet. It is the exercise of that very power that has not gone down well with Dr. George, especially given the allegations that were made against him to justify his removal from the cabinet, as if any reason were needed for the exercise of his executive authority. And all hell then broke loose. Now, ironically, this kind of controversy within the DA is taking place in an important electoral year, just as the controversy occasioned by then Western Cape Premier Helen Zille's tweets about the supposed benefits of colonialism took place as the party faced the 2019 general elections under Mmusi Maimane. The divisions within the party at the time, which saw some of its conservative members scans trained on their black leader, cost the DA votes in that election, and Mmusi Maimane was made a scapegoat. It is legitimate, therefore, for us to ask, will the same happen in the 2025 local government elections, especially if Steenhuisen should win re-election at the DA's National Congress in April? And will he also become the party's sacrificial lamb? Well, we'll have to wait and see as things unfold. That's all we have for you today. Thank you for watching Dr. Kaizer Nyatsumba's Perspective podcast. Please subscribe to it and share the content. To contact Dr. Kaizer Nyatsumba with a business proposal, a comment, or a suggested topic, write to the email address kaizer@kaizernyatsumba.com. Again, that was kaizer@kaizernyatsumba.com.